We know her. She's
Hi everyone, my name is Leanne. I'm the Educational Services Manager here for the Iron and Steel Museum. Tonight is my pleasure to introduce our presentation and our speaker, Ellen Endslow. But first I want to talk a little bit about the paper that I did put on the seats. The front is our next program, which is Thursday, April 4th. We have Professor Thomas Legg from Westchester University will be our lecture speaker, and he will be talking about 1800 ships, the transition from wooden ships to iron ships, and the materials and the skills needed for that. On the back side is a little bit about our Rebecca Lukens Award ceremony, which is coming up in May. Right now we are accepting nominations for the award. The criteria are on the back of those pieces of paper. The nominations can come from anybody in the community, and it is a regional award, not just a Coatesville, not just a Chester County award. So you can think outside the box. But just use the admin at steelmuseum.org email if you do have any suggestions, and they will become part of the ballot for the committee to vote on. And then we will reveal the recipient later this month, and then the event will be in early May as well. For right now, I'm going to introduce Ellen here. She does have over 20 years of experience in the museum field, so if you need to know anything about museum field, she is one to talk to. She is the Director of Collections and Curator for the Chester County Historical Society in Chester County here. So she oversees the museum, the library, the photo archives, and the Chester County Archives too, I believe there. So any care of the objects, any interpretation, and things like that, Ellen is responsible for all of that at Chester County. Tonight she will be presenting a program called Pieces and Patterns, Quilt History in Chester County. So she is going to talk about quilts in the 1800s, I believe, what their characteristics are and how Chester County quilts differ from other regions and how 1800s quilts differ from other eras. So please join me in welcoming Ellen.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I love talking about quilts. And so I'm going to ask Leanne, do you have a timekeeping device?
I do.
Could you give me a sort of a warning at about 6:35?
Sure.
Because we have show and tell, which is sort of a bonus. You get this special opportunity. We don't usually bring artifacts to programs because it can be problematic, particularly when they're textiles. But I'm just going to tantalize you at the moment and say one of the quilts, well actually more than one of the quilts, but the one that I brought from Chester County is attributed to Rebecca Lukens, and folks here can let us know what they think of that attribution. But in the meantime, I am, like I said, delighted to be here to talk about quilts and Chester County. And before I do that, I would like to do my own little advertising, if I may. I've been given dispensation. If you don't have anything to do next weekend, we have our annual fundraising antiques show, which is at Church Farm School this year, where we have over 40 antiques dealers with lots of goodies that you can spy and drool over and decide that maybe you want in your home. But if not, and you just like to window shop, do come by to the antique show, and I'm going to leave this over here. This is a two-part program, in essence, and in the terms of the PowerPoint. And the first part are going to be quilts that are in the CCHS collection. The second part are quilts that you might have seen had you been involved in our quilt documentation project, which I cannot believe was more than 10 years ago. In 2002 and 2003, and there's a volunteer right here in the group who participated for the entire year. It was funded by the PHMC grant that we got for that project, and you'll learn more about that when we get to those slides. I will apologize in advance for some of the quality that you're looking at, but I would encourage you to stop by and see quilts. Call us up, ask us if we can get something out for you if that intrigues you that much, because quilts are kind of hard to photograph. And as a result of that, I was scanning slides. Does anybody remember what slides were? So some of these are scanned slides in order to show you some of the stories, tell you some of the stories about the quilts that we have here in Chester County. This quilt is actually kind of upside down, and it's gigantic in real life. It's over 100 inches square. It is what we call a whole cloth quilt, and even with the quality of the photograph being what it is, you can probably see two slightly different colors there. And they're both sort of greenish or bluish, and that is sort of what the color was. It was not a pure white quilt. But what's interesting about it is that the rectangle, the bottom of this picture is actually the top of the quilt. But the center lighter color is a mid-1700s quilted petticoat that was pulled apart and sewn back together again in that rectangle, and then the border was added, and that petticoat was allegedly worn by a member of the Ashbridge family when she got married. And what's interesting about that petticoat is that they took the waistband, or it was a gathered waistband, I think, and they took that apart, and when they sewed it together across the middle, you can also see that they sewed up the slit that would have been in the petticoat that would have served to be the place where she would have put her hand in for her pocket. And I'll tell you more about that later. So this is recycling at its best, and it's what we call a whole cloth quilt because the emphasis here is on the design of the quilting. How many people here are quilters? Okay. Quilting, for those of you who may not be familiar, is actually the act of using stitches to hold multiple layers together. Most of the bed quilts that you're going to see tonight are 3 layers. The top, the batting or the middle of the sandwich, and then the backing. And mostly you're going to see the tops of quilts. And in this case, this is in the tradition of 18th century, and this is, as I noted earlier, from the 1700s, and that's when whole cloth quilts tended to be popular because they were looking at it from the point of view, there we go, of well, the fabric that was used to make it. And silk was not an unusual kind of fabric to use for quilts, and I'll talk more about that in a second as well. Another way, the quilting stitches that you saw on the first one were the emphasis there, but here you see an emphasis on the surface design, and on the right-hand side is a photograph from a book of cord quilting. I don't know if anybody here has done cord quilting. I know people have raised their hands when I've asked that. I think it's amazing that, I jokingly say it's amazing they're still alive and haven't gone bonkers, because you take 2 pieces of fabric, sew a channel, parallel lines, curved usually, you make a slit in the back, and then you force a cord through that channel you just made. And people did bed hangings like that. So that's a tremendous undertaking. We have none of that except, I'll take that back, we have some Victorian era mantle covers that have cord quilting, but it's not typical for Chester County, at least as far as we've seen. On the left-hand side, we see a little bit of stuffed work that today was called Trapunto, but it was not necessarily at the time. But that's where you have, you sew the design through a couple of layers of fabric, you make a couple of slits in the back, and you stuff in wool or cotton, and you make that 3-dimensional appearance. And that was a pillowcase that we have in our collection. Again, we have some stuffed work, but not very much. This is a very large quilt that is owned by Winterthur Museum. They gave me permission to use this in this talk, and it is gigantic as well. This is yellow silk, and it's done in the cording style, and over there on the detail on the right-hand side is a medallion that in real life is probably about that big. So there is a huge amount of detail in a small amount of space, and if you can't tell what it is a ship, a sailing ship. And this was made this was made in the Mediterranean, I think is the latest research, and it was imported to the United States. People bought quilts in the 1700s. This was a status symbol. It was a way to, people of wealth would have been required to buy this. It is silk that you can, as I described, and there's an enormous amount of work involved in making that. Here you see a less fancy but equally fascinating whole cloth style of quilting, if you will. This was made in the United States, and on the left-hand side it's a printed fabric. In the slide you would not be able to see the quilting, which is an overall diamond shape. In this case, the interest is in the printed fabric. That was an expensive thing to have in the 1700s and early 1800s. What simplified and made more cost-effective printed fabric was what you see on the right-hand side, that pillar print. Here you see a bed quilt that is made out of, the repeat is probably about, each pillar is about that big. And so it's a fairly large pattern, and that would have been made about the 1810s, 1820s, because, and it's cotton, both of these are cotton, I should say. And that would have been made in the blue one would have been made in the Empire style, where women's dresses. If you think of the Jane Austen movies and they're wearing those high-waisted, very simple, columnar-looking dresses, that's the same era. And that pillar print, Winter Tour has a number of things with that. It was made in different colors. You could use it just like today. You could get your, you could buy fabric to make a quilt, or you could get your upholstery in this. You could make your home design in red or green or a combination of colors. This just happens to be blue, and this person was really frugal because if you look carefully and know anything about fabric, in between the pillars you see sort of a white streak. There are two of them through the middle. That's where the selvage is. So they worked right to the edge of the selvage to take full advantage of the width of the quilt. This is a quilt that was made in the 1700s that is printed, and it says Associators, and it may have been connected with Benjamin Franklin and his associators. Does anybody know what that is?
Militia type of individuals.
Excellent.
French and Indian time period.
They associated with the regular military, hence the name the Associators. And in fact, the National Guard still has some of that designation today. So that is an interesting whole cloth quilt that was of the same fabric. That is printed to look like that. This is the last piece that I have from Winter Tour. This is a palampour, and I bring this up because that is the way that fabric is printed. It's not pieced, it's not appliqued. People in India made this fabric, and then it was turned into a quilt. And again, if you were to see it in person, it would be that diamond-shaped diagonal plain quilting overall, because here the interest again is in the printed fabric. Very costly to make.
What time period for that piece?
I think it's late 1700s, but I'm not sure. I'd have to double check that. This is one of the earliest pieces in our collection. It's also 1700s, and this is appliqué. And if you look at the detail, that's what's known as broderie purse on the right-hand side. It's the basket in the center of that quilt. It's not in great shape, which is why you can see it laying down. It's actually on the floor on top of a sheet. And if you look at the detail on the right-hand side, this is called broderie purse because they took something like a palampour or other printed fabric and cut out the shape and then appliqued that shape in a position that they wanted it. So you can see embroidery as well as deliberate applique to create that center pattern or that design that you see with baskets. You see those baskets in embroidery, and they're different shapes and sizes. You see it on samplers, you see it on embroidered pictures. You see it even engraved on clock faces, very standard for the 1700s. This is an example of applique, and this is mid to late 1800s, so this is maybe a century later or more. But this is another example of applique as well as some piecing. We did not see a lot of quilts with the garland in the border. We did see a few, and Barb can also tell me if I'm telling falsehoods as we move along here. But this is a combination of applique and piecing. Very much an example of applique. At the upper left-hand corner, just as a contrast, that is from the Baltimore area. Very swag-laden, if you will. That's my own term. But you see lots of borders and lots of curving designs, and we've got the flower basket in the middle. Again, this is about 100 years later. The larger photograph of the Chester County quilts, the quilt that you see there, very typical of Chester County layout, and you'll see more of that later on. What is unusual is the sort of very distinct grape clusters and vines around the border. We have some grapes, but not a lot in Chester County. You will find that in other places more readily. These are applique quilts, and here again the applique is what's of interest more than the quilting. And over on the right-hand side is an example. We have lots of red and green on white. And over on the right-hand side is an example where they probably, I believe, that could be a quilt where the turkey red print is the same throughout. More on that in a minute. But you can see that it has a very, the pattern of that is different than the one, for example, even down here on the left-hand side. The one in the lower left is highly detailed, and I'll just tell you that there are lots of different turkey red prints in it that reflect the variety that's typical of Chester County. On the upper left-hand side is something that I would call more of an album quilt. There is a little bit of repetition in the blocks, but there is a lot of individuality as well. It's made out of turkey red prints and some of the green fabric there, although you do see some of the grapes that I mentioned before. What's interesting is on the upper left-hand side, there are names written on that, and it was made by girls who attended the Oxford Seminary, and when their teacher moved away, and they gave this as a memento of remembrance, and they were moving all the way to Norristown. And that's the 1830s, 1840s. This is, again, a century after that, or more, or at least, at the late 1800s, and it's a much more simple design, or there's a lot more white space, let's say, in these quilts that you did not see so much in the other ones. For those people who are familiar with Hawaiian quilts, sometimes that's what these make me, I think of them, although they are a little bit different in style, but this was very fashionable. Barb, you'd say in the mid to late 1800s with those fabric and that kind of applique?
50 to 70.
Yeah. And again, more applique, fairly simple, but this is a little bit later in the 1800s. And you can see the similarity of the one on the lower right, if you remember a couple of slides ago when I was pointing out that green and red one on the right. It's reminiscent of that, but it is slightly different. The beauty of people who like to quilt is that you get to try all kinds of patterns, and the way you arrange them can really have an impact. Now, here is a quilt on the upper left-hand side that is from England and is from Letchworth? Is that the right castle? Anyway, it's from the early 1700s, and it's the earliest known piece bed quilt that I believe we're aware of. New research may have changed that. We got permission to use this detail, but it's part of a bed hanging. And you can see they sort of cut apart something that might have looked like a palampour and placed the pieces in different orientations to create a pattern that was completely different than the print that was originally created. Piecing became very popular in the early 1800s, and this piece on the right-hand side is something that someone in the audience might recognize.
Ohio Star.
Well, it belongs to somebody in the audience. This is a Huston family piece. And this was one of the earliest quilts that we saw in the documentation. I don't know if you remember bringing that in, Barbara, but it was so fragile we had to lay it on the floor to photograph it. And it's a brown print in a star shape, and the alternating white blocks in between are stuffed work in a rudimentary style. It's a fabulous, fabulous piece. And here you see that this is print fabric. We don't know much about the origins of these quilts other than that they were donated by people we think were from Chester County. But you can see fabulous detail in the print fabrics, and these are probably early 1800s, 1830s, 40s, somewhere in there. And over on the right-hand side is a red toile that was cut apart, and those are, I don't know if I can point to this. I'm going to have my back to you. But if you can see these pinkish looking things, that's the toile. That was a copper print fabric that would have looked like an allegorical story or something in literature that was depicted visually. Very popular and in fabric, and in this case it was cut apart to create intervening blocks compared to the pieced blocks that were around it. Now here's something that is more, and I should say that that toile print was also visible in another fabulous quilt we saw in the documentation. So it was not unheard of to have something like that here in Chester County. We saw some yellow, but not nearly as much as Lancaster County. I helped with the Lancaster County Quilt Documentation Project, and I would have to say the difference between Chester County quilts and Lancaster County quilts I jokingly talk about it like food. I grew up in Lancaster County, so I am used to red beet eggs and saffron noodles and dill pickles. And so those pickles, red beet eggs, and yellow color of the saffron are what I see in Lancaster County quilts. You don't see it quite as much in Chester County quilts. Maybe in the northern part of the county you get that sort of German flavor, if you will, all puns intended. But over here on the left-hand side, this is a little bit unusual, but it could very well have come from the western part of the county or the northern part of the county. And saturated with color, interesting sashing. And you may say, what is sashing if you're not a quilter? The block is like it sounds. It's the block, and you'll use Well, I'll use the yellow one as an example. Each block in the center with that sort of diamond and square shape is its own block, and then the spaces in between are called the sashing. And over there on the right-hand side, the sashing is diagonally placed, and that's the brown part of the printed fabric. And those blocks are on point, so they look more like diamond shapes in relation to the edges of the quilt. That on the right is very much like what you see in Chester County quilts, and you're going to get to see more of those. But here again, we see the sashing at play here on the left, but not on the right. The one on the left is about 1840s, and in those white squares in the center of each block, between the green stripes, there is something written in ink, and it's typically a person's name. Sometimes and we call them friendship quilts to be very generic. We don't always know how the people are related, and that's part of the fun of doing the historical research. Lots of friendship quilts in Chester County. Barbara Brackman is a well-respected quilt historian, and she wrote numerous articles and books over the years. And one, I believe she's the person who was attributed to saying that perhaps friendship quilts were made by people who were traveling west, because this is from the 1840s when people were doing the westward migration, which doesn't explain why so many stayed in Chester County. And we're not sure if it's a play on words like Society of Friends, meaning the Quakers, because some are made by, we know that they're Presbyterians or other Protestant religions, but there were plenty of them made by Quakers, and so there could be a connection. We're just not sure about that. It needs more research. But on the left-hand side, you see that the sashing separates the blocks. On the right-hand side, we have fun with tessellation. Here's a math teacher? Who taught geometry? Tessellation has to do with intersections and the geometric, where things cross over and how the shapes work. If that person on the right-hand side made that quilt in the late 1800s or early 1900s, had put sashing between the blocks, it would look entirely different. Here, where's the block? You could make that block begin and end in so many different places, and that's the fun of that red and white geometry. If you can see the little squiggles in the white, depending on where you're seated, those are names. This was a fundraising quilt, very typical of the red and white fundraising quilts from the late 1800s or early 1900s. Now, since I do know how to quilt, I would never call myself an expert, but I like to piece, and this is why. It is straight lines. Mm-hmm. And this is okay, those of you who do any kind of craft, whether it is textile or anything, show of hands, does anybody have an unfinished project?
Never.
Only one?
Yeah, only one. Well, she didn't finish hers in 1840, so you're off the hook. These are quilt blocks, and we do have a collection of those. And she did a very nice job. And because I like to piece, I can be really fussy about looking at intersections and points and corners and things like that. And even though I might not live up to the skill of this person, she did a pretty good job, and I'd have to compliment her on her stitching. All by hand, even though sewing machines would have been available in the 1840s. They were beginning to be mass produced at about that time. She did this by hand, and she was so frugal that you see in the lower left-hand corner of that right picture, she seamed her turkey red print fabric together. And that's the back of that. Can you see her seam on the left-hand side? You have to look pretty carefully. It's right underneath that, on the right hand, it's right there underneath the right side of that white block. She did a pretty good job. So piecing is typically done, it's not always, there are some curved patterns, but mostly it is straight lines and geometric like this. That turkey red fabric, in this case, is all of the same fabric in that block. Hold that thought, because we'll get back to it. In the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you will see a block that is similar to that, but it's in a finished quilt. And I took a picture, and I didn't think of it until afterwards. That sort of black oval shape is actually the metal print that might have been used for the print of the name that you see in the center of that square. Most names were handwritten, but there were some quilts where people had, just like today, where we got a little stamp, and you can put one name in and stamp it, and then put another name in and stamp it, and some quilts have that as well. You can see the handwritten name on the lower left-hand side, and there's a handwritten name on the on the far right-hand side. Again, we see a variety of turkey red prints. Over here on the left, you can see, if you look carefully, that there are at least two depicted prints of different examples in that quilt. Now I'm going to really talk about turkey red. Does anybody know about turkey red? And you keep quiet. All right, turkey red. It gets its name because it was made in Turkey. It's cotton fabric, and it's dyed red. And this was probably madder rather than cochineal. People conquered foreign lands to find cochineal, which were little insects that had a very durable red dye. And this is pre-chemical dyes. And anyway, turkey red prints became very affordable in the 1840s for several reasons. Number one, you start with a solid red fabric, and then you go through what is they call a discharge roll, and that bleaches out the pattern that you then want to print. And then the roll keeps going, and then the 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 or more colors are added with each next roll. And that was a lot faster and a lot cheaper than doing hand printing, like the Huston family of Philadelphia. They had the long stretches of fabric, and you can still find hand-printed fabric today at high-end fabric manufacturers, and it's very costly because it's time-consuming. You stretch out the fabric, you create the color on each print, each board, each block, thank you, that's the word. And you go down the layer or the row of the fabric with each color, and you have to register to make sure it's in line and everything else. Doing it by roller printing was much faster and, like I said, more cost effective. But one of the other reasons why cotton fabric became more affordable, because I'm going to back up, in the 1700s, if you look at inventories from Chester County farmers as an example, almost everybody had some kind of flax. We have a climate where you can grow flax, and flax, I think, was the first or second highest economic exporter from Chester County, and they were sending it to Europe, Ireland, and so forth, because we had the climate to grow the flax and create the seed so that they could replant it elsewhere. And we had a lot of linen, which comes from flax, and it was therefore something that a lot of people had. Cotton was very expensive. Cotton became less expensive in the 1800s because why?
Cotton gin.
The cotton gin. And who was feeding the cotton gin?
Slaves.
And slave labor in the South. The vast majority of cotton fabric that was manufactured in the United States and Europe in the early 1800s came from the raw materials produced by enslaved labor in southern United States. So there you see where part of our conundrum is with fabric production and what kept the cost low, in essence. Here you see a quilt, though, that has lots of turkey red prints on it. And I'm going into this because this is a really cool story. And I'm going to be a curatorial geek for about 5 minutes. And that is that this quilt had been in our possession since the 1980s, and it exhibited several times, and people had cataloged it and done an inventory of the names that are one name per block. And what's interesting is that 1/2 of the blocks on the one side are women's names, and 1/2 are men's names. And so we think, well, that's really kind of interesting. I wonder why that is. What was intriguing is that when it was inventoried very nicely, the grid on the paper did not have space for the far right column, so they wrote the names down on the bottom corner of the sheet of paper. When we did more research on it several years ago, the volunteer who was working on it, it was an exhibit at the time, and the volunteer who was working on it literally came practically running back to my desk and said, "Ellen, you've got to take a look at this." So we go down to the exhibit, and she lines up the names correctly on a new sheet of paper and starts doing the research. True story. There are 49 blocks in this quilt. There are 24 different turkey red prints that are symmetrically arranged on the blocks. So the turkey red, you can't see this easily in the slide, but the turkey red print on the outside, let's say the lower left corner, matches the turkey red print in the lower right corner. And furthermore, if there are husbands and wives on the quilt, they are in symmetrically placed squares. So that leaves the center column. Well, what's that about? because the center column is the odd one out, and those turkey red prints are symmetrically placed vertically. So it's completely well thought out and planned, and it turns out that this volunteer was saying, gee, I don't know how these people are related to each other. And she goes back to the original genealogy work that she was doing and discovered that the center column is reserved for the sisters and their siblings of the people in the center block. So that's a whole family in that center column. And in 1852, somebody in Marshallton thought that these people, I think their last name is Williams, thought that they should get this quilt, and we have no idea why 1852. It doesn't relate to when they got married, it doesn't relate to a wedding anniversary, but that center block has examples of the turkey red fabric that's in all of the blocks surrounding it. And that's pretty cool for quilters, and I bet the people who made it are up there saying they finally got it. Quilts, we tell stories about quilts and they have a purpose, but this one was made just for the sake of making it. Sorry about the slide. It was very hard to photograph at the time because it's a dark green silk that is in the surrounding the large star. And this was made in the 1850s, and what happens in the 1860s? The Civil War. And there was something called the Sanitary Commission. Does anybody besides Tom know what that is? Besides you two? All right, go for it. Duke it out. Who wants to share it?
The Sanitary Commission, Civil War time period.
It's the precursor to
The Red Cross.
Bingo. This was a group who, in the northern Union states, who decided that the soldiers really, and they were in not great condition, both in terms of food as well as medical care. So they made it their business to raise money to provide those things for the Union Army. And so they would have fairs throughout the northern cities, Chicago, Philadelphia was one of the biggest ones, New York and other places. And you would pay a fee to see exhibits or whatever. And that money that was raised would be used to buy those supplies. And this quilt hung in the Sanitary Commission fair in Philadelphia, according to the family story that went with it. Here's a quilt that was actually made to commemorate a cause, and it may be hard to read, but this was for the purpose of prohibition. This was made by somebody from the WCTU, which stands for, everybody?
Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Right, and this was active in Chester County in the late 1800s. This is an example of how you can take a particular shape of a piece of fabric, and the way you arrange it gives you a whole different look depending on where you place it. On the upper left-hand corner, anybody, that's called, the pattern is tumbling block, and that's a three-dimensional, deliberate three-dimensional look. And on the right-hand side, it looks more like hexagon. Yeah, starburst. And on the upper left-hand corner, that is an excellent example of where the chemical dyes come into place. What do you see that really stands out to you that's maybe a little different than the quilts you've seen before?
The blue.
Blue? That's a great call. And there's magenta. You don't get those things necessarily that good or that bright in nature. Yes, there was indigo, but that was a much darker blue. So this is a chemically produced, in essence, quilt, or the fabric, the silk that was made, that was dyed, is chemically dyed to look like that. This is a crazy quilt that is in fabu condition. Crazy quilts tend to deteriorate because of those chemicals over time if the quilts are not stored in an even climate. But this is a beautiful crazy quilt that's made in about the 1880s, and it is really as bright as that slide suggests. And you can see that there are blocks arranged within the quilt, but within those blocks it's asymmetrical. We have fans, we have insects, we have flowers, we have fancy embroidery, and this was all part of the movement that was influenced by the opening up of Japan, and that whole really brilliant, silky, asymmetrical look that was very popular at the time that those design ideas started coming west. I'm not a great fan of spiders, but I can deal with them, but I love this embroidered spider. And you can see the detail, and anybody who does handwork here, do you want to know it's this big? There's a lot of detail in that, and then there are little owls on the upper right-hand side. Quilt documentation days take a lot of people, and we have people on the team here who are counting stitches, literally, We have people photographing, we have the people who are bringing the quilts, and that little kid who came, he's now out of high school, I think. But anyway, he was just as chipper as could be, and he was like that. They were there for a couple of hours, and he was just as happy as a clam. So that was very exciting. And then over on the far right side, we have people collecting the provenance or the family history, if people knew it. We did not, it did not deter us if people had no idea of family history, but we would record it if we had it. On the left-hand side, you can see that there is a black and white gauge next to the quilt, and each section is 1 foot, so that gives you a sense of the size. And we used inventory numbers so that we could keep the ownership confidential. And if people would like more information when they look at the database, we act as the go-between so that people can hopefully have access to it. Now look at that. Look how big that is. And this sucker is heavy. Ooh, that's a professional word, yeah. And there's the detail. And we always turn the corner and photograph the back so that you could see what the backing looked like and get a better idea of how it was bound on the edge. And we had 13 pages of characteristics to document, so it was quite a calling. Now this one should look familiar to somebody else in the audience. Yeah. There we go. I didn't even try that. That was in here. I like talking about this, and Beth, you want to say a little bit about it?
This was done by the members of Birmingham meeting for the 275 anniversary, I believe. So each person who wanted to offered to design and make their own block, and then my mother actually put the quilt together, and then we all met regularly to do the quilting itself.
So this is a quilt that tells a story, and you can see through these depictions of things or events something about what people thought life was like at the time when the Birmingham meeting was discovered. Here is another story, and it's going to come up in a second, and this is a story quilt that was made by, she was actually, it also helps she was an art teacher and used her creativity, but 3 generations of people worked on these quilts, and what our documentation covered was quilts that we thought or believed or knew were made in Chester County and made by people who were born before 1930. So we didn't care about the age of the quilt, we cared about the age of the quilter, because we wanted to capture some of that design and hobby influence that was very predominant after World War II. We didn't want to lose out on the bicentennial. But we also have 7 or 8 quilt guilds in the area, and heavens to Betsy, we would have so many quilts of contemporary nature that we would still be documenting if we had gotten to see all of those things. But this shows you a life story of this family, and the genealogy is in that rectangle on the left-hand side. But you can see here the different techniques that they used. So, for example, the scanned photographs. We have the yo-yo quilt sort of flower arrangement on the lower right-hand corner of the overall picture. And these family members lived in different states, and so she decided to have the red roads be the connector. And just as a side note, there's a UPS truck on one of those, and the grandkids used to think that that's the UPS man brought all the cookies, because Grandma mailed cookies. Here you see a typical Chester County quilt, slight variation on one you had looked at earlier, with lots of triangles or squares within a larger block. It is another friendship quilt with names written in the center of the block, and this one also has a fancier center square. Not unusual, but not required. You don't see that on all of the quilts like this. We documented utilitarian pieces, and this is a sort of velvet-like or velveteen quilt, and that this one is not sewn, but rather it is knotted, and that's because it's so thick and the fabric is so thick. This was brought in for documentation by a good Quaker family, and you think, oh my gosh, what about all of those bright colors? Well, not all Quakers, there weren't any real prohibitions against bright colors, although they tended maybe not to wear so many bright colors. But this is a beautiful piece, and I believe this one is now in our collection. I think that this one came along with the other one. Because the woman brought it in when she was, I don't know, 89 or 90, she's still alive. And it's totally amazing, and I'll tell you why in a second. Same family, silk remnants, And she said, "Oh, would you like to document the dress that some of the fabric came from? Or the leftover fabric?" One of the myths of quilting is that all quilts are made from scrap fabrics. Some of them are, not all of them. People really did go out, and my mother would think, she liked quilts, but there was a little bit of folly to her that you would go out and buy fabric and then cut apart to put it back together again. But that's what some people did. And here you see an example, though, that this truly is a scrap quilt. And if you look on the right-hand slide, you see the dress, and then there's a block with that bright green that has that same fabric in it. And she knows the history of the people and so forth, so it's tremendous documentation. Same woman brought in this partial quilted petticoat. And if you look at inventories of the, I have no idea what my time is.
6:45.
I'm talking way too much. All right. This is a relatively contemporary quilt from a McCall's pattern, 1970s. She actually saved the magazine with the pattern. Sometimes we had the quilter, and she was willing to reveal her age, that she was born in 1929, I think. And Ina was willing to be photographed next to one of the many quilts that she made. And this is one from a pattern book, and I showed this at Tel High last year, I think. And the maker of the quilt came into the program just in time to see it. Stunning. It even took her probably a year. It's a remarkable piece. This was made by somebody who won the blocks at a quilt show out in Arizona. It was in the Southwest. She used the other colors as the pieces. Oh no, this is the one. I'm sorry, I got it mixed up. This is the one that is owned by people in the room. That was just fabulous. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece. And you can see it's, this is a much better photograph than the one from our collection because you can see the stuff work in between those piece blocks. And it's fragile because of the nature of the dye on the brown fabric. That is just the way it is. Sometimes it just begins to deteriorate the fibers, and we just treat it with a lot of care. And there's another one like that in the Lancaster History Center, the Lancaster Historical Society. There's the toile that we saw. This is one side. This is the back. And it's a very heavy one. Grandmother's flower garden, but it's arranged instead of the sort of flowers, we have stars. A family quilt that's still in the Pusey family. Beautiful piece. It's sort of an album quilt. It's kind of unusual, but still laid out like a lot of Chester County quilts. Utilitarian, coming apart. That's just fine. Same family owns this one. Made by another Pusey family member, a Quaker from the western side of the county, with names of all the siblings in the center there. It's exquisitely done. And I think more than half of those people, including the quilt maker, died before the age of 30 or 35. This is a stunning example of same quilt, stuffed work. It's just amazing. There's memorabilia that came with it, including the daguerreotype of the person who made the quilt. And the family is hanging on to this. They know what they have, which is really cool. This is early 20th century. And does that boggle your mind? There's a detail. And this is an Isabel Huston quilt. Is this the one in the bag? All right, you'll get to see this one up close and personal. So I'm going to skip over that one. Unusual to have a quilt here in Chester County made out of cigar box flannel, but that's what this is. You see them in other places. It's all kinds of flags. That's a log cabin pattern that it looks more like courthouse steps, but you get the same idea of those geometric way they're folded. A different version of a crazy quilt. This is, to me, crazy quilt meets Amish quilt. I don't get this. I've never seen anything quite like it. I don't know if you have, Barb, but it's just.
It's an Amish quilt. It's probably 30s, 40s.
And it's got that sort of asymmetrical piecing in the blocks. It's fascinating.
They were 50 years behind the times.
So there you go. This is a turkey red quilt top, unfinished. Same thing here, and you can just get a sense of some of the patterns that they were included. And there's one more in the same family. This is a summer spread that is one layer, but it is, and it's applique, but the edge is bound. And that's from the Oxford area, and that's exquisite. I mean, look at the center square alone. The applique involved in that is unbelievable. And it's beautifully done too. And the showstopper there with that color, it just sort of pops out, at least it does to me. And there we go. So I'm gonna stop on that one. And we have show and tell, and I don't know if you want to say anything about this quilt in the, we have some real quilts.
Sure.
Do you want to talk about this one?
The one that is on display over here to your right is Isabella Huston's quilt. Was made in the 1840s by Isabella, who would have been Rebecca Lukens' daughter. She was lived in Terracina, just down the way. Barb, I know you came in and you helped our collections manager discover a little bit more about this quilt. If you want to step in, you can say something. I know it is a very elegant quilt. It was a sign of wealth to be able to have something like this in material in this way. That's about all I have to say. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to share.
It's gorgeous fabric.
It's
That's-
gorgeous.
It's gorgeous fabric.
Fabric was expensive. Ellen alluded to it being more affordable. Well, more affordable was relative.
Right.
You still had to be a Lukens or
Still had to
type
be-
person
yes.
to afford the fabric. The stripe, or we call it strippy layout, is typical for that time period in this Chester County, Northern Maryland area. In quilts, Ellen was talking about Chester County quilts, but there's also more of a regional thing, like Chester County dips into Maryland and Maryland dips up into Chester County, and that is common for this area. And it has beautiful quilting. Very small
I'm not going to
stitches.
unfold this thing the whole way just because of its fragility and the amount of space that we have. But this is, and I'm thinking that maybe if we fold, do you mind if we fold this inside out, or so that the outside?
You can do what you want,
Okay.
what you need to do.
We'll fold this so that people can come up afterwards and see it. But we're not going to do the whole thing. So if you want to grab that other side, what we're going to do is fold it like this. There we go. So that gives you some idea of the design of this quilt, which is really kind of, I mean, it's just, the work is amazing. And what we're going to do, just to keep it moving, is let's fold it in half like this and put it on the other part of the table in the middle. And then, just not to mess up any quilts, I'm going to do this just to protect the other quilts for the time being. We got a call from someone a couple of years ago who said, we have a quilt in the family, and my daughter it really loves history, but she believes that this quilt belongs in a museum. I might need your help, so hang loose. This quilt belongs in a museum, and we think that Rebecca Lukens made it. Now we're thinking, right? Yeah, sure. Everybody wants to attribute things to famous people, right? In they walk and open up the box, and Heather Hansen, the collections manager, and I almost fell on the floor. As beautiful as these quilts are, and they are spectacular, that you've just seen. Here's one that is 122 inches square. Therefore, it will not come out, we won't bring out the whole thing in one piece. I am going to turn it like this, and what we're going to do is open it up across this sheet for the time being, and then we'll take turns. We don't want to take away from the other quilts, but this is a quilt. If you hold up that corner, I am going to we're just going to do that. If you want to see a pea silk quilt, here you go. We almost fell on the floor because these silks, now Heather is more knowledgeable than I am, but even with my limited knowledge, I'm aghast because these are silks that look like they are like dresses that we have in the collection from the 1820s and 30s. So even if Rebecca Lukens herself didn't actually make it, and she might have, she certainly was familiar with the fabric of that time.
Yeah.
And she may have helped with it in some way or certainly touched the fabric. And again, this would have been, we talked about the myth, but here's an example that this is kind of a scrap quilt. Very, very nice scraps, but an array of printed fabric of blues and purples that you just don't see, and it's just not faded. This is kind of fabric that was made before chemical dyes, and therefore you don't usually see it in such good condition. So this is what I brought to show from Show and Tell, since it's and I don't take this on the road, as you can see, because it's kind of a hard thing to work with. But since this has a Lukens provenance, it seemed only fitting to bring it to the talk tonight. So I'm going to fold this over a little bit.
What is the back?
Blue.
Is it silk as well?
No, that is polished cotton.
Where does the silk come from?
That's an imported thing, probably, and they probably used it for clothing or knew people who had clothing and it's left over. That is dress fabric, some of it. But there's a beautiful stripe on here that looks like a dead ringer for one of our dresses.
What's the story that tied it to the Lukens?
It descended in the family. You had a question in the back?
Yeah, what would you, back in the 1820s or 30s, what would you use a quilt that size for?
Well, it's amazing how large quilts are. That yellow quilt that I showed you from Winter Tour is at least that big. So quilt beds were actually fairly substantial, and then they had to go down over the quilts went down over the side. And the thing about Chester County quilts, and I'm overgeneralizing a little bit because there were some utilitarian ones, you know, those little postage stamp ones with the little triangles you saw quickly at the end. They tended to be really heavy winter things that you laid under to stay warm. This is not some. This is more like a showpiece. Chester County quilts are different sizes, but it is not unusual to find one that's fairly thin and very large. And I'm not sure, we have beds in our collection, some of them would have accommodated a quilt this size, but it's hard to, you know, really grasp how they would have been used. But this is 122 inches is actually not too unusual for Chester County quilts. 100, 110,
Are there standard sizes like we have today, or it was just kind of you stop when you stop?
The only thing that was standard was influenced by the loom that made fabric for the backing, as an example. But they would piece together fabric on the backing to accommodate the design on the front. And yes.
What do you think the batting is on that, for that?
Don't know, but it could be. It's in too good a shape, so we can't see it. And I think if we held it up and saw, I don't know that we can really see through it. Sometimes there's some cottons. Yeah, this is too dense. Some cottons are just thin enough that you can see the little cotton, pods inside, and you can tell it's cotton. I would guess that this is probably
Silk or wool?
It's fairly lightweight. It's hard to tell. It's very thin, whatever it is.
So that's a thin quilt.
Very thin.
Up in the northern part, we called them just for nice,
Yeah.
which is the German part. I don't know what the English called them, but it was very common for quilts to just be decoration.
And
You
we
had blankets
Yeah.
to keep you warm. Your quilt was not to keep you warm.
And this is one that we had this on exhibit, and we had to actually extend it up to the ceiling and then create a thing so it wouldn't go on the floor. Yes.
So I came in thinking that quilts were all embroidered, and it appears they're not. Some of them are printed, some of them are patched pieces together, sewn on top of each other. So embroidered is not part of the quilt.
No. And in fact, really the only tradition that is pretty standard with embroidered quilting is certainly the crazy quilt era. And those crazy quilts weren't necessarily made as bed coverings. They're a lot smaller. You see that when you come up close and look at this one, you'll know that it was probably parlor decoration in some way. Very typical of that era. There are some examples of needlework on quilts, but I think by the time they got done with the piecing and the applique and everything else, embroidering it on top of that would have, I'd have run out of steam. Any other questions?
The applique word, what does it mean, applique?
Apply. Thank you for asking. That's usually part of my spiel. Applique means that you have a piece of, I'll use the white, red, and green as an example. You have a white backing fabric, and then using a variety of stitches, you have a, let's say the red turkey red, and you want to make it look like the real, and you have it cut out in a curved way. Since piecing is hard to do in a curve, or can be, applique is an easy way to do that, where you do it often by hand, and you fold it under the edge of that red fabric and you stitch it on top of the white fabric, and that's called applied, French applique. And there's no, on the back of that block then, it would be solid white, and you'd see the outline of your applique. So there you go. Yes?
I know it's a crazy question, but how long does it take to make one of these quilts?
Good question. That's a good question. Something like this.
I mean, being a novice, I mean, I just was curious.
You know, it depends on how many people are involved and how intent they are on doing it. I was given a quilt, lucky me, that's this big, and it was hand designed based on an image that I had provided, not knowing I was getting a quilt out of it. And it took the woman 3 weeks to do it.
3 weeks?
She was pretty intense, and she was using a sewing machine. Something like this, we're talking weeks, months, yeah. Because you have to plot your strategy, you have to accumulate the fabric and cut it out. It takes time and effort. And what you are looking at here, and I have to say that that's part of the reason why the quilt community in particular in the 90s, I think in the early 2000s, was up in arms when department stores would get Chinese-made quilts that looked like American quilts, because it sort of flew in the face of all of that handwork. And yeah, you can keep warm with a Chinese-made quilt, but it sort of detracted in the minds of some from the handwork and the time and the individual creativity that this represents.
Ellen, for that pattern, now when you plot it, are you plotting it on paper or are you carrying it in your head? What are they doing back in that time
Yes.
period?
A little bit of everything. I mean, they might have done drawings of it now this early, and the pattern, I'm going to ask Barb in a moment what the date of the pattern is, because it could post-date the age of the fabric that was used. But when were the first patterns printed in magazines?
In 1830s and 40s, you had the mosaic pattern.
And it went from there.
But then you didn't have fancy patterns until more like the 1870s and 80s printed. But women made sketches.
Right.
Girls whose families could afford this fabric went to schools where they learned geometry.
And one of the
all you need is geometry tools,
and the
you
other
can
thing
create this.
and we have a quilt in our collection that is what we would call English template piecing. There they would have drawn it on paper and cut it out, and then, and now, if this isn't crazy, you could do all kinds of, how many quilters do fussy cutting? That we have a fabulous, fabulous quilt top, and thank goodness it was never finished, because you can see all the paper piecing. They would take a design of some sort, sometimes with a circle in it, sometimes with just geometric shapes, and they would cut fabric and baste it to the piece of paper. And the paper, we've discovered, comes from old account books. They cut up old account books because the paper was stiff. And so you can see some of that, and they would baste it to that paper because they could get an exact shape, and then they would whip stitch all of those things together. So they basically had to sew it twice. It's hard for me to verbalize this if you don't understand sewing, but basically they had to sew it twice, and they used the paper pattern that they created to make the shapes exactly fit together.
Does part of the Society's collection include some of the plans that might have survived?
A little bit. It was such a casual thing at that point that we do have some quilting patterns where once you were finished with the piecing and the applique, you could then mark your quilt with the design that you wanted to then do your stitching. But we do not have many of those patterns. That's something that people tossed. if they had any at all.
And they weren't printed commercially
Right.
at that point.
No,
Right.
they were just hand drawn, right?
So
Yeah.
who wants to go make a quilt now? Yeah, there we go, I see a hand go up. So I'll take more questions, but in view of the time, and I think it's after 7 o'clock.
A little bit after.
I would love for people to come up here and to take a closer look at these quilts if you promise not to drool on them. So anyway, I don't know how we want to take a look at this. I think I'm going to fold this one back so we can reveal the other two, because it's just really terrific examples of different ways of piecing and quilting, and I think you're going to like all of it. Okay, so thank you very much, and come on up.
So I have another question, while everyone's looking at those. As you're cataloging quilts, I saw that you had people that are sitting counting stitches and whatnot. During that time period, often it would be multiple people that are quilting. Do you keep record of maybe an approximate number of people that worked on it by the different stitches, or do you not get into that much detail?
We would have a hard time knowing that, because somebody on a good day or a bad day may do different stitches.
Okay.
So that's a piece of the quilt puzzle.
Or
we will
maybe
never
in the
know.
opposite, could you ever look at it and say, yes, this looks like it's all the same stitch?
You could do that,
Okay.
but that would be guesswork. And I will tell you this, we do have a quilted petticoat made by an extraordinary seamstress named Ann Marsh, and it's a beautiful robin egg blue petticoat.
I thought so.
19 stitches to the inch. True story.
So it looks like they use different sheets, they use different colors of thread. Like this looks like a different color than that. I had always been under the impression that they always use
Do
the
it,
same.
do it, go home and
Okay, so yeah, no, that's why I was under the impression going back that far that they did use one color for it, but, you know, I didn't know if they were trying.
The strip, there's really two kinds of quilts.
One person might have done it.
Masterpiece quilts. And then there's the use them and wear them out quilts.
Women quilted together.
Quilts and the individual would be more likely to make the use them and wear them out